The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the faintest sounds seem louder. A distant hum of a street lamp, the soft rustle of autumn leaves outside, it was a peaceful, almost sacred silence, save for the rhythmic breathing of an infant in his crib. Ethan Harrison lay beneath a soft blue blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady, unbroken intervals. He was only 8 months old, but in those few months, he had already endured more than most do in a lifetime. His parents, Mark and Linda, had spent countless sleepless nights at his bedside, searching for signs of improvement, a flicker of movement, a twitch of his toes, anything. But there had been nothing. His legs, once full of life and potential, lay still. The doctors had said his paralysis was permanent. In the dim glow of a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, Linda sat in a chair just outside Ethan's nursery, her fingers clutched around a baby blanket that she hadn't washed in weeks. It still carried the faintest scent of her son, a scent she was terrified of losing. Across from her, Mark sat on the couch, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor as if searching for answers in the worn carpet beneath him. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Linda whispered, her voice fragile, almost breaking. Mark inhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "We have to keep hoping," he murmured, though even he sounded unconvinced. Hope was a cruel thing when it dangled just out of reach, a whisper of a promise never fulfilled. At their feet, Charlie, their 6-month-old golden retriever, lifted his head. His deep brown eyes flickered between his grieving owners and the nursery door. Ever since Ethan had come home from the hospital, Charlie had rarely left his side. He understood, in the way that only dogs can, that something was wrong. Tonight, however, something was different. Charlie's body was tense, his tail unnaturally still. His ears twitched as he watched the nursery door, as if sensing something no human could. Linda barely noticed. She let out a shaky breath, pulling the baby blanket tighter around her fingers. I just wish love was enough," she murmured. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that tonight, love would be enough. Tonight, a miracle was about to unfold. Mark Harrison had never thought of himself as a man who prayed. He had been raised in a quiet, working-class neighborhood in Spokane, Washington, where faith was something people whispered about but rarely discussed. His father had been the kind of man who believed in hard work over miracles, and Mark had carried that belief into adulthood. But now, as he sat in his living room, the weight of his son's condition pressing down on his chest like an anchor, he found himself wanting needing something to believe in. Across the room, Linda sat with Ethan's blanket still clutched in her hands. She had hardly moved from that spot all evening, her fingers absently running along the fabric's edges as though the soft threads might somehow offer her comfort. Ethan had been diagnosed with infant paralysis at just 6 months old. No warning, no explanation. One day he was fine, kicking his legs in his crib, reaching for her hair with tiny, eager hands. The next, he wasn't. The doctors had run every test. Scans, blood work, nerve studies. Each time, they would shake their heads, their faces etched with the same tired expression of clinical detachment and quiet pity. They told her what parents in these situations are always told: we don't know why. And we don't know if it will ever change. That was 2 months ago. 2 months of waking up to silence, to a baby who should have been crawling by now, pulling himself up on furniture, laughing as he discovered his world. But instead, he just lay there. Still. Silent. Trapped in his own tiny, motionless body. Linda could still hear the voice of the neurologist from their last appointment, his words so cold they had felt like ice in her veins. You need to prepare for the likelihood that Ethan may never regain mobility. That sentence had shattered something inside her, something that she wasn't sure could ever be put back together. Now, as she sat there, staring at the baby monitor that showed her son lying in his crib, his little body limp and unmoving, she felt the same hollow ache that had lived in her chest for weeks. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she had whispered earlier. But what she really meant was, "I don't know how much longer I can watch my baby slip away while I stand by, helpless." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. He had always been the strong one, the one who kept things together when everything else was falling apart. But lately, even he had felt the cracks forming beneath the weight of it all. "You think I don't feel the same way?" he finally said, his voice tight. "Every single day, I walk into that nursery, hoping, praying, that today will be the day something changes. And every day, it's the same." Linda looked up at him, tears shimmering in her exhausted blue eyes. "Then why do we keep doing this?" she whispered. "Why do we keep hoping for something that's never going to come?" Mark opened his mouth, ready to answer. Ready to tell her that hope was all they had left. But before he could speak, a soft whimper broke through the silence. Both of them turned toward the source of the sound. Charlie. The 6-month-old golden retriever lay at the foot of the couch, his ears perked, his eyes flicking between them and the nursery door. Ever since Ethan had been diagnosed, Charlie had barely left his side. At first, they had thought it was just puppy instinct, a natural attraction to the smallest member of the family. But as the weeks passed, they realized it was more than that. Charlie wasn't just keeping Ethan company, he was watching over him. Protecting him. Linda sniffled, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "At least someone still believes in miracles," she murmured. But Charlie didn't move toward her like he usually did. Instead, he let out another small whimper, his tail stiff, his entire body tense. Mark frowned. "What's wrong with him?" Linda followed the dog's gaze. He was staring at the nursery door. For the first time that night, Linda felt something, an unease she couldn't explain. "I don't know," she admitted. "But it looks like he's waiting for something." Mark exhaled, leaning back against the couch. "It's late," he muttered. "We should try to get some sleep." But neither of them moved. Charlie stayed where he was, unmoving, unblinking. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere in the back of Linda's mind, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the grief, a single thought crept in. What if he knows something we don't? The house was steeped in silence, save for the faint hum of the baby monitor on the coffee table. The blue screen flickered, displaying a grainy image of Ethan lying motionless in his crib. The rhythmic sound of his breathing filled the room, steady but unchanged, as it had been for months. Linda rubbed her arms absent-mindedly, trying to shake the lingering chill that had settled over her. Something felt different tonight. It wasn't just the heaviness in her chest, or the exhaustion that pulled at her limbs, it was Charlie. The golden retriever wasn't acting like himself. Normally, at this hour, he would be curled up on his dog bed, snuggled into a worn fleece blanket Linda had given him when he was just a tiny pup. But tonight, he wasn't resting. He was pacing. His paws barely made a sound against the hardwood floor as he moved in restless circles near the nursery door. His ears twitched, his tail hung stiff behind him, not wagging, not relaxed, but alert. Mark had noticed it too. He ran a tired hand over his face and exhaled. "What's wrong with him?" "I don't know," Linda murmured, watching Charlie's every move. The dog stopped suddenly, his body going completely still. His deep brown eyes were locked on the door to Ethan's nursery. He took a slow step forward, then another, his nose twitching, as if picking up on something unseen, something only he could sense. Then, without warning, Charlie stood on his hind legs and placed his front paws on the crib's wooden frame. He let out a low, whining sound, not a bark, not a growl, but a soft, pleading cry. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Mark sat up straighter. "That's new." Charlie nudged the crib with his nose, then turned his head back toward the door, glancing at them, as if he were trying to get their attention. "Something's wrong," Linda whispered. Mark hesitated for only a second before pushing himself off the couch. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and reached for the doorknob. The nursery was just as they had left it, dimly lit by the nightlight, the faint scent of baby powder and fresh laundry in the air. Ethan lay still in his crib, his tiny arms resting at his sides, his face peaceful in sleep. Nothing seemed out of place. But then Charlie let out another soft whimper, this time more insistent. He pressed his nose against Ethan's blanket and nudged it carefully, as if urging the baby to wake up. And that was when Linda saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Ethan's fingers twitched. She froze, barely breathing. "Mark," she whispered, gripping his arm so tightly he flinched. "Did you see that?" Mark's eyes widened as he stepped closer, watching. Ethan's fingers, the same fingers that had remained still for 2 months, twitched again. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was real. Linda's hand flew to her mouth, a sob choking in her throat. Charlie let out a sharp, excited bark. His tail, which had been still all night, wagged for the first time. For a long moment, neither Mark nor Linda spoke. They didn't dare move. Then, Ethan's fingers curled again, stronger this time, more deliberate. Linda let out a shaky breath, her voice trembling. "Oh my God. This wasn't just coincidence. Something was happening. And somehow, Charlie had known all along." Linda's breath hitched, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She didn't dare blink, didn't dare move, afraid that if she did, the moment would vanish like a dream slipping through her fingers. Mark stood frozen beside her, his eyes locked on Ethan's tiny hand. The fingers twitched again. Charlie let out another soft bark, his tail wagging furiously now, as if he had been waiting for this all along. "Ethan," Mark whispered, his voice barely more than breath. He reached forward, his hands trembling, and placed them gently on his son's crib rail. "Ethan, buddy, can you hear me?" Ethan's eyelids fluttered slightly, his tiny lips parting just enough to make the faintest of sounds. Then, as if responding to his father's voice, his whole hand lifted from the mattress, slow, shaky, but deliberate. Linda gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears blurred her vision as she turned to Mark, searching his face, needing confirmation that this was real, that she wasn't just imagining it. Mark's expression was a mix of shock and something else, hope. A fragile, desperate hope that he had buried months ago, suddenly clawing its way back to the surface. "He's moving," he murmured. He turned to Linda, his voice breaking. "He's moving." Linda's knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor beside the crib, reaching for Ethan's tiny hand. His fingers curled weakly but unmistakably around her index finger. A sob tore from her throat. "Oh my God. Mark, he's really..." Ethan let out a soft noise, a tiny whimper of effort, and his other hand twitched. Charlie barked again, almost triumphant, his front paws still perched on the crib's railing. He nosed at Ethan's blanket, his excitement growing. And then, just as Linda thought her heart couldn't take any more, Ethan's legs, motionless for months, twitched beneath the blanket. Mark staggered backward, gripping the edge of the crib like he needed to steady himself. "No," he breathed. "No, this isn't possible." But it was. Right before their eyes, their son was moving. A fresh wave of sobs racked Linda's body as she looked up at Mark, the weight of the moment crushing her. "Call the doctor," she choked out. "Right now. Call them." Mark scrambled for his phone, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. As he fumbled to dial, he kept glancing back at Ethan, as if afraid it would all disappear before he could get someone to witness it. Linda never let go of her son's hand. "You're so strong," baby," she whispered through her tears. "So strong." Ethan's eyelids fluttered open, revealing those same deep blue eyes that had always reminded Linda of the sky before a summer storm. He looked at her, blinking as if seeing her for the first time in months. Then, slowly, so slowly, his gaze shifted to Charlie. The puppy let out a soft, almost whimpering sound, tail still wagging. And then Ethan did something that shattered Linda's heart into 1,000 tiny pieces. With the greatest effort she had ever seen from someone so small, he lifted his weak little hand and reached toward Charlie. The puppy immediately leaned in, pressing his warm nose against Ethan's fingers. The moment their skin and fur touched, Ethan let out the smallest, sleepiest, but purest little giggle. Linda and Mark both let out a sob at the same time. Because this was impossible. Because this was happening. Because this was a miracle. The phone in Mark's hand buzzed as the emergency line picked up, but for a long moment, he just stood there, staring at his son, at the puppy who had never given up on him. And suddenly, he wasn't sure if he even needed to make the call. Because in that moment, he believed in something he never had before. Hope. Mark stood frozen, the phone pressed against his ear, but he barely registered the voice on the other end. His mind couldn't catch up with what was happening. Ethan was moving. He blinked, his breath unsteady, watching as his son's tiny hand rested on Charlie's soft golden fur, his fingers curling ever so slightly. The puppy whined softly, nuzzling into Ethan's palm as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Linda clutched the crib railing, her entire body trembling. "Mark," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Did you see that? Did you?" "I saw," Mark choked out, his voice cracking. It was as if the air in the room had changed, thick with something unspoken, something powerful. The past 2 months of despair, the endless nights of helplessness, the crushing weight of doctors' words, all of it had led to this exact moment. And then, Ethan's legs moved again. Not just a twitch. A shift. A push. Linda gasped and nearly collapsed onto her knees beside the crib. "Oh my God." Charlie let out a soft bark, stepping back, his tail wagging so fast it was a blur. He paced excitedly before jumping back onto his hind legs, paws resting on the crib's wooden frame. Ethan's lips parted, another soft sound escaping, a baby's attempt at laughter. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs as he finally forced himself to move. The phone nearly slipped from his hand as he dropped to his knees beside Linda, his fingers reaching for Ethan's tiny foot beneath the blanket. He hesitated. He was afraid to hope too much. Afraid that if he touched his son, the moment might disappear. But when his fingertips brushed against Ethan's skin, he felt it. A tremor. A kick. Not strong, not steady, but real. A sound left Mark's throat, something between a sob and a disbelieving laugh. He turned to Linda, his face streaked with tears. "He's moving, Liv," he whispered. "He's really moving." Linda couldn't speak. She just reached up, gripping Mark's arm like she needed something to hold on to, something to ground herself, because this wasn't supposed to be possible. Ethan blinked up at them, his big blue eyes unfocused with sleep but filled with life in a way they hadn't been for months. And then, as if drawn to the very force that had never left his side, his gaze found Charlie. For a long moment, baby and puppy simply looked at each other. Then, with an effort that seemed to defy every medical certainty, Ethan lifted his hand again. This time, deliberate and full of purpose, his fingers sought out the warmth of Charlie's fur. The puppy let out a sharp bark, pure excitement and joy, before pressing his entire body against the crib as if he wanted to climb inside. Linda let out a sob so deep it shook her whole body. She covered her mouth, her entire world tilting in that moment. Mark couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed the phone from the floor and, with shaking fingers, redialed. Yes, I need a doctor, right now. The emergency line operator started to ask questions, but Mark couldn't explain. How could he? How do you put into words something that shouldn't be happening? My son, he's moving. Mark's voice cracked. They said he never would. But, he's moving. Linda reached forward and touched Ethan's cheek, her hands trembling with disbelief. Sweetheart, she whispered, her tears falling freely now. You're so strong. Do you know that? You're so strong. Ethan let out a soft baby coo, his fingers still buried in Charlie's fur. Charlie, sensing the weight of this moment, let out a long, happy sigh and curled up against the crib, his eyes never leaving Ethan. He had waited for this. He had known. For 2 months, he had never given up on his boy. And somehow, in a way that no human could ever explain, that love had been enough. The sirens came fast, too fast. Linda barely had time to gather her thoughts before the pounding of paramedics' footsteps filled the house. Everything became a blur, flashing lights, voices asking urgent questions, the rush of movement. But Linda and Mark never let go of their son. They never stopped holding on to the miracle that had unfolded in their living room, the moment that changed everything. And when the paramedics lifted Ethan from his crib, when they checked his vitals, his reflexes, their stunned expressions told them what they already knew. Their son had been given back to them. Against all odds. Against every piece of logic. Because sometimes, love defies reason. Sometimes, hope finds a way when science cannot. And sometimes, miracles come in the form of a tiny golden retriever who refuses to give up. The morning sun crept through the blinds, casting soft golden streaks across the nursery walls. For the first time in months, the house felt different. It wasn't just the quiet weight of uncertainty anymore. Something had shifted. There was a warmth in the air, something lighter, something hopeful. Mark sat on the couch, still holding Ethan, his son's tiny fingers wrapped around his own. He had spent the rest of the night just watching him, afraid to close his eyes, afraid that somehow, when he woke up, this miracle would be gone. But it wasn't. Ethan had stirred in his arms, shifting, stretching, things he hadn't done in months. And now, as the sunlight danced on his cheeks, he was awake. Not just in the way he had been before, staring blankly at the ceiling, but truly awake. Linda stood beside them, unable to tear her gaze away. Her son looked at her. Really looked at her. His blue eyes, once so distant and unfocused, were now filled with something she had thought she'd lost forever, recognition. Hey, sweetheart, she whispered, brushing her fingers over his soft brown hair. You're here with us, aren't you? Ethan let out a small sound, a faint coo that nearly shattered Linda's heart. Charlie, who had curled up at their feet, suddenly perked up at the noise. He scrambled onto the couch, placing his front paws beside Mark and nudging Ethan's hand. Ethan blinked, his tiny fingers twitching again. Then, with effort, with pure determination, he reached toward Charlie. The puppy let out a joyful yip, his tail thumping wildly against the cushions. Linda sucked in a breath, covering her mouth with her hands. It was real. It was happening. Mark looked over at her, eyes glassy with emotion. He's fighting. He's really fighting. Tears slipped down Linda's cheeks, but this time, they weren't from grief. This time, they were from something so much greater, relief. In that moment, she realized just how much they had been drowning in sorrow, how long they had been trapped in their own fear of what they might lose. But they weren't losing him. They were getting him back. She knelt beside Mark, running her fingers along Ethan's small arm, feeling the warmth of his skin, the faint flex of his muscles as he stretched toward the dog. Charlie licked Ethan's fingers, earning another quiet giggle from the baby. Linda laughed, pressing a kiss to Ethan's forehead. I missed that sound, baby. You have no idea how much I missed it." Mark let out a shaky exhale. He had been so afraid of losing hope, so afraid that if he let himself believe in miracles, it would only bring more disappointment. But now, he had no choice but to believe. Because his son was here. His son was moving. His son was laughing. And it had all started with a little golden retriever who refused to give up. Linda turned to Charlie, placing a hand on his soft fur. "You knew, didn't you?" she murmured. "You knew all along." The puppy wagged his tail, resting his head on Mark's lap, eyes bright with contentment. Linda smiled, wiping her tears away. "Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for never giving up on him." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she and Mark weren't drowning anymore. They weren't grieving. They weren't afraid. For the first time, they were truly living again. And it was beautiful. The days that followed felt like stepping into a world they had once only dreamed of. Each morning, Linda woke with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. The routine that had once been filled with silent grief, checking the baby monitor only to see Ethan still and unresponsive, had transformed into something miraculous. Every day brought a new change, a new sign that Ethan was coming back to them. His fingers curled with more strength. His arms reached a little farther. His legs, once lifeless beneath the blankets, began to kick softly. The first time he truly grasped Linda's hand, she nearly collapsed from the weight of the moment. Mark caught her as she let out a soft sob, half laughter, half disbelief. "He's stronger today," she whispered, pressing Ethan's tiny fingers to her lips. "Yeah," Mark said, his voice thick. "He is." Charlie had become more than just a family dog. He was Ethan's constant shadow, never straying too far from his side. He seemed to sense when Ethan was trying to move, when he was frustrated, when he needed encouragement. The puppy would nuzzle him, bark softly, as if cheering him on. It was undeniable now. The doctors had no explanation. They ran tests, measured reflexes, asked questions. But all they could say was that Ethan was improving in ways they hadn't thought possible. They called it unexplainable. Linda and Mark knew better. This wasn't just a recovery. It was a miracle. One night, as Linda rocked Ethan in her arms, Charlie curled up beside them. She whispered, "You're going to be okay, sweetheart." And for the first time, she believed it. Mark stood in the doorway, watching them, arms crossed over his chest. His face was softer now, the exhaustion that had weighed on him for so long beginning to lift. "Linda," he murmured. She looked up. Mark smiled, a real, genuine smile, one she hadn't seen in months. "We're gonna be okay too." And she knew, deep in her soul, he was right. They were no longer just surviving. They were living again. They were a family reborn. The doctors had no medical explanation. They called it unexplained. A rare case. A spontaneous neurological improvement. But Linda and Mark knew better. It wasn't just science. It wasn't luck. It was love. It was hope, even when hope seemed impossible. It was the unwavering presence of a little golden retriever who never stopped believing, even when everyone else had. Charlie hadn't just been Ethan's companion, he had been his guardian, his silent encourager, his link back to the world. He had sensed something no one else could. He had stayed by Ethan's side, nudging, waiting, watching, believing that one day, his boy would return. And Ethan had. Not in a grand, cinematic way. Not all at once. But in the smallest moments. A twitch of fingers. A flutter of eyelids. A tiny hand reaching for fur. That was how miracles happened. Not always with thunderous revelations, but in the quiet, unshakable persistence of love. Because sometimes, miracles come in the form of four-legged angels. Sometimes, hope is reignited in a soft bark in the night, a warm nose pressing against a still hand, a wagging tail at the foot of a crib. And sometimes, love is enough to bring someone back. Mark stood in the doorway one evening, watching as Ethan sat propped up on a blanket, Charlie curled protectively beside him. The baby's fingers, so small, so fragile, were tangled in the puppy's fur. A lump formed in Mark's throat. He had spent months drowning in fear, thinking hope was a lie that only hurt more in the end. But now, watching his son, truly watching him, alive, aware, fighting, he knew the truth. Hope had never left them. It had been beside them the whole time. With 4 paws and a golden coat. Linda joined him, slipping her hand into his. Neither of them spoke, because some moments don't need words. Instead, they stood together, watching the miracle they had almost given up on. And as Charlie's tail thumped softly against the floor, as Ethan let out a small, sleepy giggle, Linda smiled. "Never give up hope," she whispered. Miracles happen in the most unexpected ways. And sometimes, they come with fur and a wagging tail.